Thank you, Alan. Yeah, it's amazing. 50 years ago, we were in high school. Time goes by really, really quickly. I brought you a lotus blossom from my garden. And as you all know, it's very significant in Buddhism. It has all kinds of symbolism. It usually lasts about 3 days. The first day, it's tight like this. Second day, this is a second day blossom. It's beginning to open. The next day, it fully opens. And then inside, and I would invite you to come up and smell it. You know, you might have a hallucination or something. I mean, it's got a really exquisite, exotic aroma to it. But after the third day, the petals fall off, and then the seed pod inside continues to grow. If you look inside it now, it's yellow, but it'll continue to mature and become that green seed pod. And that seed pod is usually the platform, the days on which the Buddha stands or sits when a Buddha is painted or carved as an image, as a statue. So it is significant, as you all know, to Buddhism. It grows in a pond filled with mud and muck, the mud and muck of ignorance, and out of that ignorance comes this wonderful, beautiful, exotic flower of enlightenment. So anyway, I will leave it here for you to enjoy. As Alan mentioned, you know, I've been saying some of these things for 30 years, and some of the things I'll say today might be a repeat for some of you who might have heard me in a previous time. So I apologize for repeating myself, but I also have some new things that I'd like to throw into the pile of suggestions that I have to make about how it is that Shinshu and really Buddhism in general here in Hawaii can think about and consider in moving towards the future. Fairly recently, when I gave a talk, after I gave a talk, lady came up, and someone who had been, I guess, heard me in earlier time, and she said, "You know, you're getting to be real mellow." And I said, "Well, I'm getting older, you know." And she said, "You're not as radical as you used to be." And so I thought, yeah, that's true. You know, when I was younger, I guess like many of us, you know, I was a young Turk. And now I think of myself as just kind of an old turkey, just getting old and mellow. But in that spirit of getting old and mellow, in other words, not talking so much about radical kind of break from the past, what I have to talk about today fits in with, I hope, your theme of evolution. That we look to the past, and while, yes, we have to change from the past, while, yes, we have to break from the past is what informs us as to how it is that we might go about making that change. And that is exactly what evolution is all about. Any kind of change is a break or a difference from the past, but evolution implies that there's a kind of a continuity. So what I'd like to do is to talk about some things, some suggestions, and look to the past for the inspiration for some of these suggestions. I must tell you also that in my current thinking, you know, that's informed by my study of the history of Buddhism, particularly in Japan. But more recently, I've been doing more work about Buddhism in Hawaii and thinking about the history and learning about the history of Buddhism in Hawaii. That some of the suggestions I have today are informed by that kind of thinking, and particularly by the experience that my wife and I have had in the last few months, where we have visited every Japanese Buddhist temple in the state except for 2. But we're writing a guidebook to Japanese Buddhist temples in Hawaii, and the research for that consists of visiting every temple. And it's been an amazing trip, really interesting. We've seen all kinds of temples in all kinds of circumstances, in all sorts of situations, talking with ministers, talking with congregation members, and learning a lot. And so some of what I have to say is coming out of that experience of looking at our own backyard, at our own history of development here in Hawaii. I think the overall lesson we can learn from looking at the past is that nothing is more traditional than changing tradition and even inventing new traditions. A tradition that does not change or does not renew itself will eventually die because times change, people change, values, circumstances, culture changes. And traditions have a tendency to remain fixed. And institutions often find themselves in a problem when they're rooted in tradition so strongly that they're unable to adapt to new circumstances. And that may be the situation with a lot of temples here in Hawaii, where we have a very strong sense of tradition, about how we have always done things, and we think about this long tradition of Buddhism that has this really remarkable past that goes to Japan, goes to China, goes to India, 2,500 years, 2,500 years of tradition. That's a very strong claim that the past has upon us. And we tend to kind of fix tradition. But the really interesting thing about this Buddhist tradition, and it's unlike any other religious tradition that I know of, the really interesting thing about the Buddhist tradition is its open commitment to change. You remember that Shakyamuni Buddha himself, one of the basic teachings is everything changes. Everything comes to be and passes away very quickly. Another symbolism of the lotus blossom, because it lasts only 3 days. It's very ephemeral. It's very temporary. Everything changes. But here's the really remarkable thing about Buddhism as a religion, and that is that in every other major religious tradition, the scriptures are fixed. It's a closed canon, the canon being the accepted official collection of holy writing, of scripture. Christians cannot add any more gospels to the New Testament. It is closed. Jews cannot add any more prophets or proverbs to the Hebrew Bible. It is closed. Muslims cannot add any more surahs or chapters to the Quran. It is closed. And those books are about this big. The Buddhist canon is how big? It's wider than I can stretch my hands, because the sutras, the scriptures that were written, were written over many, many centuries after the Buddha died. And while each sutra claims to be or purports to be a sermon by the Buddha, written down by someone who actually heard the Buddha, we know historically that that's not the case, because the earliest sutras were written 500 years after the Buddha's death. It is very hard to say that any of the scriptures actually represent the words of Shakyamuni Buddha himself, because so many of the scriptures were written so late. Now, it could have been passed down through oral tradition. That is true. But there are literally thousands of sutras. The Buddhist canon has thousands of sutras, and it is an open canon, which means that Buddhists throughout the history of Buddhism, in all places, in India, in China, in Japan, at some point felt that they needed to write a sutra, that they needed to put the teaching of Shakyamuni in their words. And so they sat down, and most of the writers are anonymous, so we have no idea who they are. They're ordinary people like you and me. And they sat down and they said, and you follow the style of a sutra, which is to begin with saying, "Thus have I heard. Once the Buddha was on Vulture Peak, and he said," and then you write down what you think he said or what makes sense to you. And this is why the Buddhist canon is so huge, and why it is an open canon, and why sutras can continue to be written by ordinary people. It's a real do-it-yourself religion. And so when we think about the history of Buddhism, the tradition of Buddhism, we need to remember that it is one of the most remarkable traditions that is committed to deliberate change, even in terms of the scriptures. I mean, this is unheard of. Other religions don't change their scriptures, but Buddhists can write new scriptures. We can write, and we need to write a sutra for Hawaii. In fact, I wrote one. It's called the Diamond Head Sutra. And I wrote a long time ago. It's one of the sins of my youth. And I read it recently, and I thought, God, that's about the stupidest thing I've ever heard of. But the point is that, as a matter of fact, all of the sutras that we have were written by ordinary people like you and me to fit their circumstances. Okay. I'd like to talk about a specific suggestion, and I think they might even be in a kind of a summary of what I have to say today. Namely, 7 points. One is I want to talk about the Shinshu doctrine. And then I want to talk about teachings and the difference between doctrine and teaching. And then to address the issue of practice in Shinshu. And then music, gathas. And then temple governance. And then this last idea that I have of building temples or growing temples on the basis of participants rather than members. Because as you know, members are really hard to get, and it's hard to grow temples on the basis of members. But it may be possible, again, looking to the past, I was seeing how we might be able to grow our temples through participants. Now, before I get into these specific suggestions, I'd like to repeat something that I've been saying for the last 30 years, namely, the training of ministers and the ordination of ministers. And we're still tied to Japan. Now, a lot of the training is done locally, that's for sure, but still the final ordination has to be in Japan. And this is so anti-tradition. Talk about radical. This is so radical because the tradition of Buddhism is for Buddhism to go into a new country, into a new geographical and cultural area, and become independent from the place from which it came. So when Indian Buddhism went into China, it became Chinese Buddhism. And Chinese Buddhists did not go to India to be ordained. And when Chinese Buddhism went to Japan, it became Japanese Buddhism. But when Japanese Buddhism came to Hawaii, it still is Japanese Buddhism. We don't think of Buddhism here in Hawaii or on the mainland as being an American religion or Hawaiian Buddhism. We think of it still as a Japanese religion. And this is because we're still tied to the institutions in Japan. And the training of ministers is really done according to, really Japanese style. Now, even though we do a lot of the training of our local ministerial candidates here in Hawaii or on the mainland, our thinking is still sort of old-fashioned Japanese Buddhist. We're what, 3rd, 4th, 5th generation English-speaking, American-educated people. We don't speak Japanese mostly. And yet, when it comes to the training of ministers, we require them to speak Japanese because they have to go to Japan and get their ordination. And if you look at the curriculum of what it is that our local ministerial candidates study, it's all the traditional stuff. It's the history of Jodo Shinshu. It's Shinran. It's the rituals, the chanting, all of that. They don't study, I don't think, or not much, the history of Buddhism in Hawaii. And that's kind of insane, don't you think? That for a minister who's going to be operating in Hawaii, not to know about the history of our own communities, of our own temples. And so I think the ministerial training has to be not just done locally, but has to be done with a local kind of curriculum. Yes, of course, they have to understand the history of Buddhism in Japan and Shinran and HONPA, HONGWANJI and all of that. But in addition to that, they really need to know something about our own story and how we do things here. And really, the institution here should have as Japan has, as China has, as India has, our own authority to ordain our own ministers. And this is in the spirit of being good parents. I mean, many of you are parents, and you don't raise your kids to be dependent on you. You raise your kids to be independent, and you send them out. Say, go, you make your own decisions. I might disagree with what you're deciding to do, or who you're going to marry, but that's your life. And we continue to have a good and loving and cooperative relationship. And so I think when you think about your leadership, one thing you might think about is the question, who can best represent the Hawaii Kyodan and go to the Honzan, the Kyoto headquarters, and negotiate independence. And to achieve that in a spirit of friendship, in a spirit of cooperation. We have examples of some temples here in Hawaii that have broken away from their Japanese headquarters, but they've done it in a kind of a messy, complicated way with a lot of bad feelings on both sides. That's not the model of independence that we should follow, I think. I think we can do a better job of becoming independent and remaining on good terms with Japan. Now, the other consequence of taking control of our own ministerial training and thinking of it and setting it up in terms of our needs, local needs, is that it will be necessary, it seems to me, because I tell you, one of the most common complaints I heard in visiting temples throughout the state of Hawaii is of the younger ministers who come from Japan, who can't speak English very well, who don't really understand Hawaii, who are not into the culture, who don't understand some of the values that we have. And that's not surprising. They're foreigners. They're young. They just graduated from Ryukoku University, and suddenly they come here. Oh, they may have a few weeks of orientation, but that's about it. No ministerial training. And it seems to me that a local ministerial training program could be set up not only to train local ministerial candidates, but also to train those ministers who are coming from Japan. If they don't speak English well, then we got lots of English conversation programs at our local universities or at private schools, and they need to go through intensive English conversation training. What do they know about the history of Hawaii? Have they read any history of Hawaii? What do they know about the history of HONPA HONGWANJI? Have they read A Grateful Past and a Promising Future, that wonderful history of HONGWANJI written by Ruth Tabra? Have they read Louise Hunter's book, Buddhism in Hawaii? There can be a curriculum set up. What do they know about social service agencies that are available here in Hawaii, so that as they face problems amongst their congregation, they know who to turn to for different kinds of help? There's so many things that a minister needs to be trained. What do they know about preaching a sermon? Another common complaint that I've heard, and not just about the new ones coming from Japan, but even among some of the older, about some of the older ministers, how to preach a sermon. In a Christian seminary, ministers are taught. There's a whole curriculum. There's a whole curriculum called homiletics, and it's how to preach. What kind of training do we give our ministers? We know they don't get much. There's a little bit, but not much in Japan. But again, we're not worried about Japan. We're worried about here. And so there can be set up a program for training ministers. We visited one temple in Maui where the woman that we were talking to, one of the lay leaders we were talking, was so frustrated with dealing with ministers who are coming from Japan who don't know about Hawaii that she finally wrote a training manual. And she showed it to us. Here's our training manual. We make our sensei read this manual, and we sit down with them and we have lessons about how it is that we do things here and what our history is all about. The expertise for that kind of training is right here in this room. There are teachers here who know about public speaking. There are teachers here who know about local history. There are teachers here who know about teaching. There are social workers here who know about social agencies and so on and so on. You see, there's so much talent that we have right here in this room that if only we organize ourselves and thought of it in terms of local terms rather than ministerial training in terms of just history of HONPA, HONGWANJI, and Shinshu and all of that, you know, I think we might be able to help. And really, it's kind of cruel to throw these poor young ministers straight out into a temple after just a few weeks of cursory orientation. Because that's the other thing we heard. Not just complaints from temple members, but from ministers themselves who said, oh, it's so hard, you know. We don't speak English that well, and we don't understand the community that well. And, you know, these poor guys, they have not had much help from the Kyodan here, and there could be an organized, structured, formal course of training ministers from Japan. So we need to think of ministerial training, not just for the local candidates who need to learn the ways of HONPA HONGWANJI, but about Japanese ministers who are coming to Hawaii who need to learn about the ways of Hawaii and the temples here. Okay, what is Shinshu doctrine? If I ask you to give me a one-sentence summary of what Shinshu doctrine, would you be able to do it? Now, one of the difficulties of being able to do it is again, we're looking to the past. The history of Shinshu, like the history of every other Buddhist sect, like the history of every other religious organization, is one in which the definition of doctrine is highly controversial. And it's always changing. At different times, at different places, there have been different statements about what is the true doctrine. And the reason why there are so many denominations in Buddhism as well as in Christianity and every other religious tradition is because at some point, one group is going to say, no, that's not right. You know, that's not what the teaching is all about. You know, it's really this. And then the other group is going to say, no, it's not that. You know, you're a bunch of heretics. And so the heretics will go out and form their own group. They'll establish in time their own orthodoxy. And guess what? Within that group, there's going to be somebody who said, no, that's not how it is. You know, that's not what we're all about. And then the once heretics, now orthodox, are going to say to them, you're a bunch of heretics. And then they're going to go out. And it goes on and on and on. You know, this is why the study of the history of religion is so interesting, because you just keep seeing these breakaway movements. And we need to remember that Shinran was exiled because he was thought to have been a heretic, because he broke away from Mount Hiei and Tendai orthodoxy, as is true with Dogen for Soto Zen, as is true for Nichiren Buddhism, and so on and so on. I mean, you know, it's standard to be a heretic, to come up with your own definition of what is the doctrine. What is the philosophical, spiritual tenet and foundation upon which the group or the institution is going to be based? And so there's nothing, again, unusual, if we look to the past, about doctrine changing, about doctrine being redefined by people for whom that doctrine needs to make sense. Because often the received doctrine is old, was suitable for another group, another generation, but not for us. And again, if we think of this whole sutra writing tradition where, you know, you can sit down and write your own, we can put the teaching of Buddhism into the mouth of Shakyamuni and say, this is what he said that day on Vulture Peak. So it doesn't have to be complicated, and it might be orthodox, it might be heretical. You know, orthodoxy and heresy is a matter of point of view. It's really relative. But what it does need to be is clear. It does need to be clear, and it does need to be meaningful. We need to be able to say, this is what we stand for. This is our doctrine. This is our philosophical foundation. And let me throw out to you just a one-sentence attempt to define Shinshu doctrine. Having awakened to the compassion of Amida Buddha and rejoicing in the assurance of Buddhahood, we shall endeavor to live the life of gratitude and service. Now, I think that's a pretty good, concise statement about what Shinshu doctrine is. But before we say, yeah, that's what our statement would be, what our understanding of doctrine will be, we need to kind of examine it and make sure we understand all the terms of it. Like, what is Buddhahood anyway? It's a kind of a funny English word, Buddhahood. What is Buddhahood? And gratitude and service. I mean, everybody's into gratitude and service. I mean, that's so generic. That's so general. What we stand for is gratitude and service, like other people out there don't. Is that what differentiates us from other people? So is this a sufficient doctrinal statement? And if it isn't, then what is? And so I think one of the discussions that needs to be carried on is, what do we understand about doctrine? And if we have a sufficient, clear understanding that is meaningful and makes sense to us and serves our purposes, then fine, we don't have to worry about doctrine, we can move on. But if not, we need to do something about it. Teaching. I make the distinction between doctrine and teaching because doctrine I think of as the sort of the philosophical, spiritual foundation. Teaching is the application or the interpretation of that doctrine to our lives. So how do you apply that? In Christian terms, it would be called applied theology. How do you apply it? How does it relate? How does that doctrine relate to our lives? And I must commend you because I think the Hawaii Kyodan has, in passing the resolution supporting civil unions, did exactly that. That's an excellent example of how you transform doctrine into teaching. The doctrine doesn't say anything about civil unions. The sutras don't say anything about civil unions. And so we have all of these issues that really the doctrine does not address directly. All kinds of issues that we face in our personal and our social, our corporate lives that should be addressed, that could be addressed in terms of doctrine. But it needs that translation because there's a gap between the doctrine, which is a general statement, and then there are the specific issues and situations that we find ourselves in, and we need to translate that doctrine into some kind of meaningful statement about the issues that we face. And you did that actually recently with your resolution on civil unions. And so there are all kinds of the other issues that we face. We face war and peace. We face stem cell research. We face consumerism. We face education. We face the economy. There are all kinds of issues that we face. Now the danger of translating doctrine into teaching is that we can come up with an ideology, fixed kind of do's and don'ts. And that's the danger of doing something like this. We could come up and say, for instance, okay, from now on, it's going to be part of our teaching that there shall be no dancing, or no drinking alcohol, or no smoking tobacco. Something like that. It could become very ideological. Or we could say, okay, in terms of translating doctrine, say, to our economics, we're for raising taxes or for not raising taxes. I mean, we can come up with different kinds of political and social ideologies that are kind of fixed. Ideologies are very useful for people who don't want to think. Because, for any situation, you just revert to your ideology. Let's see, what does my ideology say? What does my party say? what do the Democrats say, or what do the Republicans say, or what do the Tea Party people say? And what they say is what I say because I'm going to adopt that ideology. And so I think we don't want to fall into that kind of narrow translation of doctrine into teaching. So it's a lot more complicated. But still, somehow, we need to make that attempt of translating doctrine into some kind of meaningful statement about the issues that we face in our private and our public lives. I think the Pacific Buddhist Academy has done something like this in saying, all right, we're a Buddhist high school and we are dedicated to peace education. That's another example, I think, of translating doctrine into some kind of teaching. We're a school, we're going to teach about peace. So this is another example of how it is that doctrine can be translated into meaningful teaching. And we need to do that for other issues as well. All right, the third point, practice. Now, this is a real thorny issue in Shinshu. Since practice requires self-power, it's something that you do. The official doctrinal teaching or position on practice is that Shinshu doesn't have any practice because salvation is not according to self-power, according to what you do, but salvation is a gift of Amida Buddha. And so the tradition of HONGWANJI, of Shinshu, is one in which there isn't much in the way of meditation, a little bit in the way of ritual, yes, chanting the Nembutsu, but always with the understanding that these are expressions of gratitude, and these are not practices in the usual sense of the meaning of practice, which is some kind of activity that you do in order to gain enlightenment or in order to gain salvation. And one of the traditional ways of doing that in early Buddhism was through moral behavior, improving your karma, making merit, doing good things so that your karma could be good. That's how you got to go to nirvana, is life after life after life, because it takes so long, since it's so hard to be morally perfect, is to keep improving your moral record, keep improving your karmic record until you finally got to be so perfect that you would have all good karma, no bad karma, and then you would be able to go to nirvana. That's how the Buddha did it. He went to nirvana on the basis of his moral effort, not because some deity saved him. And by the way, Shakyamuni never heard of Amida. Amida is a much later, a new, again, invention in the tradition of Buddhism. All right, so now with this idea of the power of Amida, the vow of Amida, you don't go to the Pure Land because you have moral perfection. And in fact, even if you're not perfect, you can still go. Why? Because Amida's vow and compassion and assurance is what will effect that rebirth into the Pure Land. And it's not something that we would do all by ourselves. And this is why it is often said, or sometimes said, that Shinshu is beyond good and evil, beyond that kind of moral work in order to gain your salvation. Now, when the followers of Shinran heard his message, some of them said, hey, great, we don't have to be good. Amida's going to save us. We can be bad. We can revolt against our landlords. They're charging us too much rent, and they went on strike, just like the followers of Martin Luther did when he said, your salvation is not based upon good works, but by the grace of God. And Shinran had to go out and say, no, I didn't say you can stop being good. And they said, wait a minute, but you said we don't have to be good in order to be reborn into the Pure Land. And Shinran said, you're right. You don't have to be good in order to be born in the Pure Land, but you have to be good for the sake of being good. You have to be good for the sake of the social order. You have to be good for the sake of your relationship with other people. And that's the key distinction about moral behavior. Yes, in the Shinshu tradition, it does not relate to gaining salvation, but it does relate to our relationships with other people and the kind of social life that we would like to create in our families and in our communities. So in saying moral behavior is not necessary for salvation, that's not to say that moral behavior is not necessary. Shinran did not get rid of morality. Now, the same thing can be said for practice. Yes, there is no practice that will gain you salvation, because Amida's compassion is what will effect salvation. But that doesn't mean you can't do any practice. You can do practice for peace of mind, for trying to somehow gain control of your emotions, of feeling a kind of intimacy with Amida. And we need to remember that the very word Nenbutsu, what is the Nen? Nen means mindfulness. Nen means meditation. Nenbutsu originally meant meditation on the Buddha. Now, one of the ways in which, one of the techniques of meditating on the Buddha was to recite the name. And so you recite the Nenbutsu as a way of meditating on the Buddha. The Chinese Pure Land masters, Dao Cho, Tan Luan, Shan Dao, the three Pure Land masters that are part of the 8 patriarchs of Shinshu, of HONPA HONGWANJI, all practice Nenbutsu meditation. There is a long and rich tradition of meditation in Pure Land Buddhism, particularly as it centers around the Nenbutsu. And so there could be the development of Shinshu practice, again, not for the sake of, or not as a means to gain salvation, but as a means to other kinds of purposes. And there are lots of other purposes for which practice can be engaged in. The issue is controversial, of course, in Shinshu, because of this kind of confusion about what practice is all about. And some people, ministers included, think that there should be no practice whatsoever. On the Big Island, we visited a Shinshu temple, and the young minister there, put us on the side and said, people in Hawaii, they don't understand Buddhism. They don't understand Shinshu. So I said, well, what's the problem? What don't they understand? I said, they think that you need to have funerals and memorial services. I said, well, don't you think we need funerals and memorial services? He said, no, that's heresy. Heresy? I said, yeah, you don't need funerals and memorial services. I said, well, do you do funerals and memorial services? He said, yeah, but just in order to please the people. But it's not true Shinshu teaching. And he's right. It isn't. There is a long history of discussion in Shinshu about the status of funeral rituals. What does it really do, really? Is it some ritual means for sending the deceased to the Pure Land? And if that's the case, that is a heresy, because you don't go to the Pure Land on what we do. So it kind of depends upon your understanding of what the funeral ritual or memorial services does. But there is a standard doctrinal position in Shinshu that says that funerals are heretical, and this young minister was representing that orthodox point of view. I know another minister here on Oahu who conducts meditation sessions and has been criticized for it. Bishop Ogui of the BCA on the mainland has been a controversial figure because he has been promoting Zen-style meditation. So the issue of practice, as you know, is fairly controversial in Shinshu. I would argue that it is possible along the lines I have suggested to have practice, and to have practice that is consistent with the traditional orthodox position that practice is not a means to gain salvation, but practice is a means to gain other kinds of purposes, and there's no reason why we can't do that. So given the fact that American Buddhism, and by the way, there is something, scholars recognize something called American Buddhism, and it's not the Japanese Buddhist denominations. It's the mostly Zen-related groups on the mainland that have become completely independent. Here in Hawaii, like the late Robert Aitken's group, the Diamond Sangha, is considered to be American Buddhism. And Robert Aitken tells this wonderful story about how he gained his independence from his headquarters from Japan. He was having he was having a meeting with the head of the Sambo Kyodan, which is his parent organization in Japan. And the question arose, well, what should the relationship be between Diamond Sangha in Hawaii and the Sambo Kyodan in Japan? And Robert Aitken said to Mr. Kubota Roshi, why don't we have a friendly divorce? And Kubota said, sounds like a good idea to me. Now let's go have lunch. And that was it. And so Robert Aitken now trains and ordains his own ministers. He doesn't send them to Japan, and yet they still have a close and cooperative relationship. Now, given the fact that American Buddhism, and American Buddhists have a kind of a habit when they meet other American Buddhists, they greet each other, hi, how are you? And they ask, what's your practice? What's your practice? American Buddhism has been enormously successful by offering Americans practice. And I think Jodo Shinshu, if it's going to insist upon the kind of the traditional orthodox position that we don't have any practice, it might be missing an opportunity here. But also given the fact that the Nembutsu originally meant meditation on the Buddha, and given the fact that there is a long tradition of Nembutsu and other kinds of meditation and rituals performed by the Shinshu patriarchs, by the Chinese Pure Land Masters that I mentioned, and the Indian patriarchs who are part of the Shinshu lineage, and given the fact that practice can be performed in a way that is consistent. See, this is a real kind of win-win situation, it seems to me. In a way that is consistent with the orthodox position, it would be so easy to revitalize modern Shinshu by developing practice. Intrafaith dialogue. We live in a time when interfaith dialogue, that is to say, conversations between, say, Christians and Buddhists or Muslims and Hindus has become so important. And, we've been watching this news piece going on about burning Quran and all of that. I mean, the whole interfaith dialogue thing has become so important in a almost a strategic, almost a political kind of way, so that even General Petraeus has to weigh in and say, please don't do it. Don't burn the Quran. It'll be harmful to our troops. And yet we have in our country, in our community, people who simply take the simple view of, my religion is correct and yours is wrong and yours is evil and we're righteous and so we need to put you down and so on. It just doesn't work. And here in Hawaii, we have a long tradition of interfaith dialogue. Yoshiaki Fujitani has been a long-time leader of that effort. And we have organizations like Open Table and Interfaith Alliance to promote this kind of mutual understanding, and that kind of work must continue. But what amazes me is the lack of dialogue that takes place between Buddhist groups, between Shinshu and Shingon, say, or Nichiren, or Tendai, or Soto Zen, and so on. We've become so isolated. We're very sectarian. If we're Shinshu, we're Shinshu. If we're Shingon, we're Shingon. If we're Soto, we're Soto. And we don't, sort of really deal much, with the other groups, except for the annual Hanamatsuri service sponsored by the the Hawaii Buddhist Council. We have all of the major Japanese traditions here. We have Tendai, we have Shingon, we have Soto, we have Rinzai, we have Nichiren, we have, and this is not to mention the Chinese, the Vietnamese, the Cambodian, the Korean Buddhist traditions that we live in one of in a community that is one of the richest in the nation when it comes to Buddhist communities and Buddhist temples. And yet, we very seldom interact with each other. Now, I'm happy to report that just 2 days ago, I got a call from Mililani Hongwanji, and they're planning a kind of an intra-faith, to talk with other Buddhist groups. So I think this is already happening out there in the community, but I think we need to do more of it. I've been leading temple tours for many years now, and it's always amazing to find out that local Buddhists not only have very little experience in going to the temples of other denominations than the one that they belong to, but even within their own denomination, not having much exposure to the temples in their own tradition, except for maybe bon dancing and an occasional funeral. Now, I think the reason why it is important for temples to talk to each other and temple members to talk to each other is not just so that we gain an understanding of what that kind of Buddhism is all about, but to also talk about the more practical kind of problem, like how are you guys facing the issue of declining membership? How are you facing the issue of attracting younger people? Basic kinds of practical kind of issues that can be addressed. I'm running out of time here, so I gotta speed it up. Music or gathas. The gathas are great, and this is a really Hawaii tradition. We've been writing gathas ever since Ernest and Dorothy Hunt started writing them in the 20s. We have gathas. We still have them in our hymn books written by people like A.R. Zorn, F. Bluning, what was his name? Blanning Pooley, I think he was South African. We've got this amazing tradition that's unique to us. But the style has, again, fallen into a kind of a traditional pietistic, hymn singing. And try ask one of your daughters or sons or grandsons or granddaughters, if they really like the music of gatha singing, or even amongst us, oh boy, it's so boring. There's no beat, there's no rhythm, it's hard to sing, and all of this. And again, it seems to me that we have the talent in our communities here, young people, who can make music, who can write music. And we need to have Buddhist music that's done in jazz style, in rock and roll, in hip hop, in whatever, country and western, and so on. There are Buddhist groups on the mainland that are doing this already. I heard some fantastic country and western music about Amida. Great song, got a beat and all of this, Amida loves me. It's almost like a love song. You can really sort of get into it. And I think we need to do that if we're thinking about attracting younger people. The evangelical churches, Christian churches, have really zeroed in on this. I interviewed Reverend Bud Stonebreaker once. He's the founder of the mega church, Calvary Chapel. And he made, to me, an astounding statement. He said, I've never sung a traditional Christian hymn in my life. So all the hymns we sing in our church, we make it up. We have composed ourselves. And so, it's all new kind of music, and it's all with guitar and drums and electric keyboard. Alan, yeah. How much time do I have left?
Another 15 minutes if we go into question and answer after you're done.
Okay, and I should stop at what time?
11:30.
11:30? Okay, great. I once visited the great cathedral in York in England, and we were staying at a bed and breakfast, and right around the corner was a Church of England church. And if you think we're having trouble, if we think Buddhism is dying here in Hawaii, try the Church of England in England. I mean, it's like almost into the grave. So is the Church of Scotland, really, really down, really dying. So I told my wife, it was a Sunday, I said, I want to go to the service around the corner because I want to see what a dying church looks like. I know what dying Buddhist temples look like, I want to know what a dying Christian church looks like, and so we went. I was fully expecting, for there to be like just a handful of people like sometimes we see in our temples. And the minister was out in the front, and he was greeting people, welcome, 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 so we all sat down. It was about half full. The service started, and the minister sat next to me. And the service is starting. I said, don't you have to be up there? He said, no, they prefer me to stay out of it. And I'm like, what a model. I said, so what's the service going to be? He said, how do I know? He said, they make it up themselves. He said, every Sunday is a surprise. And it was amazing. They had this beautiful pipe organ in the back. They never played it. It was guitar, it was drums, it was electric keyboard, and they made up their own songs. The one I remember is, it had the word hallelujah repeated to the tune of La Bamba. Hallelujah, hallelujah. And just went on and on like that. And people were, just it was very animated. It was high energy. People were coming in, going out, coming in. Kids were sort of wandering around. And the service was organized, but it was led by different people, including a group of children who got up and did this thing about reading letters, notes that they were going to be sending to members of the congregation that were in hospitals that they had written, hoping that they would get well. All of this. It was just amazing. It was so dynamic. And I leaned over to the minister when he was coming to a close. I said, I thought the Church of England was dying. He said, it is, but not here. I thought, wow, make it all up. Make it all up. That's what they did. They were not doing the traditional stuff. They were just kind of like making it up. And the involvement of the lay people was just amazing. Try it. Leave the minister out. Make it up yourself. What makes sense? What's the music that appeals, especially to the younger people? We complain, oh, younger people don't come. Well, maybe the music's keeping them away. Those old gathas. At any rate, it seems to me here is something that we could do too. And I know there are gatha contests and the music committee. But maybe we ought to think about different ways of doing music. How about a Gatha Slam Fest, and have younger people be involved with that. Okay, governance. Again, that minister of the church in York really sort of opened my eyes to some ways in which services could be done. And the way how he had pulled it off was he had given the congregation freedom, and of course the responsibility that always goes with freedom. So yes, you can do it your own. You come up with it, but you guys have to. To do it. That's a different style of governance. That's a different style of running the temple or the church. Now, like most institutions, I think our temples are run by old-timers. And for good reason. The old-timers will say, well, it's because nobody else wants to do the work. But there are some younger people in our temples, even though they may be a few, and it's very hard for old-timers to step aside and say, okay, why don't you guys do it the way how you think it ought to be done, the way how it makes sense to you. And we will not, I promise, say, that's not how we do it here, which is the usual thing that you often get when a new idea comes up. Well, that's not how we do it here. I once had a conversation with Shioiri Ryodo, who was a very eminent Tendai scholar and a very high-ranking Tendai priest in Japan. And he was complaining. And again, by the way, we talk about Buddhism in Hawaii and the troubles it has. Church of England has that trouble. The Methodists have the same trouble. The Presbyterians are having the same trouble. And the Buddhist temples in Japan are having the same trouble. The younger kids are not interested in Buddhism in Japan. The temples are really going down. I have a colleague who's actually doing a study now of the decline of Buddhism in Japan. We tend to think, oh, everything's just fine in Japan, but the temples some of the temples are really struggling, especially the community-based temples, because the younger people are not interested and not coming. Shioiri Ryodo was aware of some of the problems that the temples faced, and he said, what Tendai needs to do is completely dismantle the institution, take it apart, just shut it down. And I was reminded of the story when Alan was saying about his idea about, well, maybe we are just out of closed shop, But Shioiri Ryodo's idea was we should dismantle it and rebuild it. Take it apart, down to nothing, and then put it back together in a way that makes sense for modern times. And that might be a good theoretical exercise. You may not want to actually do it in your temples, although maybe you might come to that point. But it might be an interesting exercise to get a group of people together and say, okay, let's start from the beginning. What would the temple look like? Forget the way how we do it. Forget our protocol and our rules and our regulations and so on. Let's look at what we are trying to accomplish. Let's look at who we are trying to reach, and what kind of institution could we just create? Just create out of empty space, and do it anew, and to create an institution that would be suitable for growing rather than for dying. I think there's something to be said about taking a hard look at how we govern, how we run our temples, and to start thinking about new ways of running the temple, and particularly in the light of, or keeping in mind that we need to really involve the younger people. The future, after all, is in their hands. That's just a sort of a given, because the old ones pass away.